everyone. Thanks for joining us on Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman. Here's what we're looking at. Trump attorneys agree to extend an order barring National Guard troops from being deployed in Chicago as all eyes look to the Supreme Court.
When we divide, we cannot win.
And a new book details Reverend Jesse Jackson's rise in politics and ongoing push for civil rights. First off tonight, the Trump administration is agreeing to a 30-day extension of an order blocking National Guard deployment in Chicago. If District Judge April Perry approves the extension at a hearing tomorrow, the order would be in place through November 24th. But the Trump administration, meanwhile, has appealed the judge's initial order to the conservative-leaning Supreme Court and says they expect the high court to rule very soon. We'll have more on this coming up in the program. 26th Ward Alderman Jesse Fuentes is filing a federal claim and seeking damages after being handcuffed and detained by an immigration agent earlier this month. In the video, Fuentes is at Humboldt Park Health in her ward where agents sought to detain a man they'd allegedly been chasing. During the encounter, she asked agents for a signed judicial warrant for that man. As a masked agent grabs her and places her into handcuffs, she was led outside and released from the cuffs. Attorneys for Fuentes say they are filing under the Federal Tort Claims Act, which allows those who've been injured, quote, by negligent or wrongful act of a federal government employee acting within the scope of his or her employment to seek monetary damages. For more on the claim, you can head to our website. Hearings over the mayor's budget proposal are underway at City Hall, and alder people are already balking at some of it. One of the controversial plans uses $1 billion in property taxes earmarked to fight blight to help balance the city's budget instead. The proposal would also send more than $550 million to Chicago public schools. The mayor's budget team says funding for projects that are already underway or close to getting off the ground would be untouched. But critics say they were alarmed by the proposal and worried it means projects will be taken off the table. Some city council members are closely questioning the mayor's budget team today over imposing a so-called head tax on large companies, which Governor J.B. Pritzker also said he opposes. For more on that, please visit our website. And we're still some weeks away from holiday travel, but O'Hare Airport is soaring after a record-setting summer season. The Chicago Department of Aviation reports the busiest summer in O'Hare's 70-year history, with 24.3 million passengers traveling through the airport during June, July, and August. That beats the previous record of 24 million in 2019. That was a pre-pandemic peak. Up next, the latest on the potential National Guard deployment to Chicago, right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Alexandra and John Nichols family, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Federal courts in Illinois are busy this week with hearings on court cases between the state of Illinois, local organizations, and the Trump administration. As we heard at the top of the show, the administration has agreed to a 30-day extension of the temporary restraining order that pauses National Guard deployment to the city of Chicago as it asks the Supreme Court to step in. Joining us on Zoom to help us walk through all of this is Chicago-Kent College of Law professor Harold Krent. Harold, welcome back. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Good to see you again.
So let's start at the beginning, and I don't want viewers to get this confused with the other hearing that we heard about yesterday, and that one was regarding immigration agents and what type of force they are used when in the field. This one, Attorney General Kwame Raoul said that he would have to wait until the president deployed the National Guard troops before the state could file suit. He needed to know what grounds the president was using in order to know what grounds upon which to file that complaint. What argument did the state and the city end up using once the president did deploy those troops?
Well, the government, the Trump administration, used two arguments to justify positioning the National Guard here. They said that there was a rebellion. Rebellion constituted people taking up some kind of physical force against the government. And they also said that it was impossible to enforce federal law without federalizing the National Guard. And those twin arguments were shot down by Judge Perry in the hearing about 2 weeks ago. She claimed that there was no seemingly possible to constitute a rebellion here. Nothing is going on out of the ordinary. And she said that even though there is some protests, local law enforcement are perfectly adequate and perhaps more adequate to respond to those kinds of demonstrations, whistling, other kinds of activities, and that there was no real absence of federal law, so that therefore those two justifications didn't hold water. And she then ruled against the president, ordering that the troops not be deployed here, and they couldn't be federalized. The Seventh Circuit then later took this just briefly and said, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, because in issuing that temporary restraining order, that came just after the intended 200 National Guard troops from Texas, the 300 from Illinois, a handful, about 14 from California. As soon as those Texas troops landed in the area, the judge issued that temporary restraining order on the basis of that lawsuit. What's been the Trump administration's argument in response to that temporary restraining order and, of course, in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals?
Well, they are abiding by the temporary restraining order, which is obviously critical. They basically said that the Constitution gives the president the final say on making the determination whether there's a rebellion and whether there's a need for National Guard because of the difficulties of enforcing federal order. And they said that a district court judge cannot second guess that determination of the commander-in-chief under the Constitution. And first, in particular, Judge Perry said that deference is appropriate to the determination of the president, but not capitulation. There has to be some kind of scrutiny of the reasoning, and she found that reasoning very threadbare, made up, changing, and not worthy of deference, and that led to her finding. And then on quick appeal to the Seventh Circuit largely agreed, though holding that the National Guard could be federalized, but they just couldn't be used in Chicago throughout until there was a final decision in this litigation. And that's when the Trump administration took this to the Supreme Court.
So this leads the Trump administration to file an emergency appeal with the Supreme Court. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the upshot is that the guards are here. They're permitted to be here by the Seventh Circuit ruling, but they can't be deployed. And they can't be deployed then unless the Supreme Court intrudes and takes its case. Now, the Supreme Court usually in the past has taken steps to help the Trump administration in these kinds of TROs or temporary injunctive relief cases, but they may not. Obviously, this is of national importance. We've seen this going on in Portland. We saw this going on in Los Angeles. So the Supreme Court can pick and choose which case it wants to decide. And now the Trump administration has given the Supreme Court more grace by agreeing to the 30-day extension. And it's signaling the Supreme Court that it will comply with the Judge Perry's order, but it really wants the Supreme Court to weigh in, and obviously weigh in on behalf of the administration.
So you mentioned Portland and the appeal that's been going on there. What could that ruling happen? What kind of indication might that ruling give us about what might be happening here? What could happen here?
Yeah, so the Ninth Circuit has gone a slightly different path than the Seventh Circuit. There was a 2-to-1 split decision, but yesterday the decision came down saying that the President Trump can deploy the National Guard in Portland based upon a very deferential reading of the record. And whether or not that's accurate or not is sort of beside the point, but we now have 2 appellate court decisions which are somewhat in tension with each other, which does call out for the Supreme Court to review at least one of the cases in order to get the law right. What does the president have to do in terms of supporting his determination that there's a rebellion? What kind of evidence must the president marshal to determine whether or not there's an absence of federal law enforcement, and therefore that would require federalization of the National Guard? So those are 2 very important questions. They've barely been touched in our nation's history. And so the Supreme Court very likely will take one or both of the cases to decide that issue. Whether they do it now or wait till there's a final decision is the question at hand. My guess is they'll take it now.
So if they take it now, that would be on the so-called shadow docket that we've been talking about a lot under the Trump administration. I mean, what kind of outcomes could we be talking about if SCOTUS does issue, if they issue a ruling soon as the administration hopes?
And the problem with the shadow docket that you just referenced is that there is no full briefing of the case. There's no oral argument. So an important issue like this doesn't get ventilated before the public. And so that's why it would be a shame. It'd be, I think, an advantage of everybody if the court would order some kind of expedited briefing in the case and an oral argument before it makes the decision. Obviously, the Trump administration would oppose that because they would say that delay is harming the national interest here. But I think it would be in the nation's interest to have that kind of percolation, ventilation of issues before they weigh in. What are they going to say? It's anybody's guess. Obviously, they're going to argue for a level of deference to the president, but they may not call for complete abdication. They may say that there's some kind of judicial review that's important to exist.
Yeah, we know this is, as we said, back in front of Judge April Perry tomorrow. We'll have to leave it there for now. Professor Harold Krent, thanks again for joining us. We appreciate it.
Take care.
Up next, CNN anchor Abby Phillip on her new book about Reverend Jesse Jackson. Who can forget that night in Grant Park, November 2008, when President-elect Barack Obama gave his victory speech, having become the first black person ever elected to office. In the audience, watching, was a tearful Jesse Jackson Sr. The civil rights leader turned politician had run for the office himself twice in the 80s. Here's a bit of Jackson's speech at the 1988 Democratic National Convention.
When we divide, we cannot win. We must find common ground as a basis for survival and development and change and growth.
Now a new book details those historic campaigns and Jackson's rise in politics. It's called A Dream Deferred, Jesse Jackson and the Fight for Black Political Power. And it's written by CNN journalist and anchor Abby Phillip. Abby Phillip, welcome to Chicago Tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Brandis.
So Jackson ran for president in 1984 and 88, but both times he was not able to secure the nomination, as history tells us. In an interview that we did with him back in 2020, he recalled some of the changes that he pushed for within the Democratic Party.
In 84, when I first ran, there was something called Winner Take All. I got 3 million new voters and only 4 delegates. Because if I got 48, somebody got 49, took all the delegates. So we democratized democracy. We changed it to proportionality. When President Barack and Hillary ran against us in 08, on the 84 rule, she would have won, because she won California, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Texas, and Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, New York. But following proportionality, he was getting, even when he was losing, he was coming a strong second. So we changed the rules.
So we hear him say, we democratized democracy. Yeah. How are some of the strategies that he used back then still reflected in today's politics? I'm thinking about the importance of voter registration and Stacey Abrams.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he really took the lessons of the civil rights movement and moved it into the next level. You know, he was a student of that movement. He was there with Dr. King. And in the 70s and the 80s, what he was saying to voters of all stripes, but particularly to black voters, is that they have untapped political power, and he wanted them to use it. And so when he went on that voter registration drive, he called it the Southern Crusade. He went to all these southern states and he said to black voters, your vote is the difference between, you know, Ronald Reagan winning or losing a campaign in 1980, for example. And that was a powerful message. And he registered millions of people to vote, helped the Democrats retake power in 1986, and really changed the structure of the Democratic Party. Now we know that voters of color comprise a big chunk of the Democratic Party. Well, Jesse Jackson was a key to making that happen. And it wasn't just black voters. He brought Arab American voters into the process, Asian American voters into the process, Hispanic voters into the process. And a lot of it had to do not just with the ballot that they cast in November, but also how the party factored them in the nominating process. So when he was talking there in that clip about proportional allocation of delegates, that's basically to say that if you have a candidate like a Barack Obama, who is not an establishment candidate, who is an outsider, they can still rack up delegates and still have a shot at the nomination. And that is the reason that President Obama was able to win the Democratic nomination in 2008, and it's probably the reason that he's president today.
Did you always see this sort of through line from Jesse Jackson's campaign to the history that we already know is written? Yeah,
you know, I mean, I always say I was born a few weeks after the 1988 campaign was over. So this book is not a lecture. It's a reminder. It's a history lesson for me and people like me who grew up in the Obama era and beyond. And I think it's important to just ask the question, what came before it? And there was a lot that came before it. And I don't think I and many other people realize to what extent Jesse Jackson paved the way, not just in the tactics of politics, you know, the delegates and all of that stuff. That sounds very wonky to a lot of people, but also in the message, in the vision that he had of unity in a Democratic coalition, of using all the different parts of the rainbow of America and putting them together in one political party. He was largely responsible for that. And frankly, in the 1980s, no one realized that, because it wasn't until Barack Obama became president that I think people started to realize, oh wait, Jesse Jackson actually did something that lasted beyond those two campaigns.
So Jesse Jackson, he's a human just like the rest of us, right? So we know that he learned, of course, from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was with him. He was there with him in Memphis at the time of Dr. King's assassination. But it was what happened afterward that caused a bit of a rift between him and other leaders of the movement at the time.
Yeah.
What was that?
You know, this is a pivotal moment in his life story. And he was there in the courtyard the day that Dr. King was killed. But after Dr. King was declared dead, he left Memphis and he went up to Chicago, and he was wearing a shirt that was covered in the blood of Dr. King. And he wore that shirt for days. And he left the rest of Dr. King's acolytes and advisors who were his peers in Memphis, and they stayed there and they were angry. And some of this has been written about and they've talked about it in the past, but that rift was so deep and long lasting for many of them, because when he went to Chicago with that bloodied shirt on, he went and he did media, he was on television, he was making public appearances, and many people in that orbit thought that it was self-serving. And that's one of the things that he's really had to live with and had to explain. And he's talked about it, and I detail this in the book. And he said that the reason that he did it was because he was young, he was a little immature, and he was angry. You know, he was in his early 20s. I think people forget how young he was at that time. And he says he was very angry, but some of those other people like Hosea Williams, they were angry too, because they felt like he was trying to step into Dr. King's shoes before he had even been buried.
Even later on, though, he could be viewed as sort of opportunistic. Like, he was very familiar with, never met a camera he didn't like necessarily, not necessarily. But, you know, he would have, during the campaign, he would have a prayer service, you know, at his home and invite the media to come and witness it. And so I think his critics also thought him as sort of opportunistic, self-serving.
Yeah, you know, he's never met a camera that he didn't like, okay? Everybody that knows him knows that. And I think that's a huge part of his personality, was that he learned very early on, throughout his decades in public life, to use the power of the media. And in a way, it was both a blessing and a curse. He was so skilled at it, better than perhaps anybody else of his generation. But at the same time, it made people think that that was the only thing that mattered to him. That there was, you know, self-serving is the word that you use, but I think that's a word that a lot of people might use to describe his love of the camera. So it's two sides of the same coin. And I do, sometimes I think, though, as I'm working on this book and as somebody who's covered politics in these recent years, that skill of using the media is something that is essential to succeeding in politics today, but it was looked at very differently in the 70s and the 80s when he was doing it. And so in a way, he was a little bit ahead of his time, and it did not work to his favor in that campaign at all.
Let's talk about the media, because journalism these days isn't doing so hot, right?
Yeah.
Only 28% of Americans say they trust the media, according to the latest Gallup poll. News deserts have hit a new high, and that is research fresh out of Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern today. How do we regain that trust?
You know, we have to be more transparent in the media about what we do and how we do it. I think that this lack of trust is also a lack of understanding. You know, I've worked in print, I've worked in television, and when I worked in print, people couldn't tell the difference between the news pages and the editorial pages. Similarly now with the internet, people can't tell the difference between opinion journalism and journalism that's not meant to be that. And in television, I think people don't understand when we talk about sources. What does that even mean? Why don't we name them? I think that they're on our end, right? There needs to be more transparency, explaining to people what we do and how we do it. And the fact that we're not saying that we don't make mistakes in this business, but when we do it, we try to correct them as quickly as possible. And that the difference between trustworthy media and media that is not trustworthy is that lack of transparency. So I think that there's work to be done there, but I also think that we have to adapt to the way that people are consuming the news. They are not doing it in traditional forms as much anymore, and we need to go where people are and take the content to them. There is a huge interest and a desire in news. It's just that the medium and the message are not, they're not syncing up, and we need to do a better job of that.
You host CNN Newsnight on weeknights, and the debates on that show can get pretty spirited.
Yeah. To say the least, yeah.
Yes. You were raised by Trinidadian parents in the D.C. area, one of 6 kids. So how did that experience and the family dinner tables, the conversations then prepare you?
Come to our Thanksgiving dinner tables. And, you know, first of all, I will say that, you know, my parents are immigrants from Trinidad and Tobago. And if you know a Trinidadian person, they're very political. They actually are very interested in politics. They're very knowledgeable about politics. So we always talked about current events. We watched a lot of news growing up, listened to a lot of news. And so that's the first part, was just that was always kind of part of the dinner table conversation. But there's always a healthy debate. In every family, every single person is different. And when you have a big family, you really appreciate the value of those different points of view. And that's how I approach my job. We have a table, and it's actually a 6-person table. That was not planned, but it's 5 guests and me. And we sit there, and every person has a different perspective. And even while we have spirited debates, the point is, let's all talk. Let's all have it out. Let's press each other's ideas. And I think that's the spirit of democracy. I wish there was more of that, but we try to do it every night. And we are really committed to the different points of view. We don't just have people who represent a narrow band of politics. We want to represent the real span of viewpoints in this country.
Both Jesse Jackson and Barack Obama, of course, came out of Chicago. We have a local, pretty popular historian who says that everything dope came from Chicago. The city, of course, just ask any Chicagoan and they'll tell you. City has a pretty rich political history as well, of course. How would you describe the role of Chicago in national politics?
Yeah, well, you know, I talk about this in the book, but Harold Washington's victory as mayor of Chicago really pushed this country into a new era. That was actually the first test of Black political power. He was able to mobilize Black voters in this city to elect a mayor, a Black mayor, as a major city mayor. And that was a huge moment. And that moment was also a signal to national Democrats about the power of Black voters. So that was actually one of the key rationales that Jesse Jackson used to run for president. He wanted to send a message to the party leaders that what happened in Chicago can happen in the rest of the country. So it really does all come back to this city in many ways. And I mean, you could say so much about Chicago's role, but this is a major American city which control of this city was a massive signal to the rest of the country. And in 1983 it was, and in 1984 when Jesse Jackson ran for president, he used Chicago as an example of what could be.
You heard it from Abby Phillip, so it must be true. Abby Phillip, thank you so much for joining us. It's good to see you.
Thank you so much, Brandis.
Absolutely. Again, the book is called A Dream Deferred, Jesse Jackson and the Fight for Black Political Power. And we're back right after this. And that is our show for this Tuesday night. Be sure to sign up for our free email newsletter, The Daily Chicagoan, at WTTW.com/newsletter. And join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 10. From public transit funding to energy costs, what will state lawmakers address during the fall veto session? Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm that gives back to the community through law and philanthropy.